Documents disclosed by Edward Snowden shows Brazil, Colombia, Venezuela and Mexico are among the countries targeted by the United States. A columnist with the Guardian newspaper in Britain, Greenwald, has closely communicated with Snowden and first reported on his intelligence leaks. Our correspondent Stephen Gibbs has an exclusive interview with Greenwald at a hotel in Rio de Janeiro.
He's the reporter who carries in his backpack the secrets of America's most wanted man. Glenn Greenwald is described as a traitor by some and a champion of free information by others. We met in a Rio hotel. He'd spoken on the phone to Edward Snowden shortly before we sat down.
He's doing remarkably well. He's been very consistent behaviorally and emotionally from the very first moment that I met with him. He's just a person who's very at peace with the choice that he made, is never exuded any fear or remorse or regret of any kind, and even after what he's been through the last 2+ weeks of having his fate be so completely uncertain, he seems there's just an equanimity to his state of mind.
While Edward Snowden decides his future, Greenwald is working through the thousands of classified intelligence files the former NSA employee downloaded. That information has already had an effect on US-Brazil relations, after Greenwald revealed that American spy agencies have been targeting internet traffic here on a massive scale. In an article published in a Brazilian newspaper, he describes how the NSA has for years systematically tapped into the Brazilian telecommunication network and indiscriminately intercepted, collected and stored the email and telephone records of millions of Brazilians. He also outlines how Brazil, despite supposedly having friendly relations with the US, seems to have been targeted. Having seen the secret NSA files, Greenwald writes that Brazil is highlighted on maps of the US agency. There is evidence that the volume of data captured by the filtering system in the local telephone networks and the internet is constant and large scale.
And is Edward Snowden part of this process? Is he saying, right, let's do this story now, or has he just handed the material to you and as a journalist you're doing what you can with it?
Yeah, he hasn't given me a new document since Hong Kong. He gave us thousands of documents when we were in Hong Kong and said to us very explicitly, I want you as journalists to make the choices about what should be disclosed, what should be withheld, and in what order, from a journalistic perspective, these stories ought to be revealed. So it's completely up to us what it is that gets reported and in what order. He has no role to play in that at all.
And how do you make those decisions? Because we've heard from Edward Snowden that amongst the material that he's got are, for example, the names and identities of undercover CIA officers. So you're making a decision of what you leak and what you don't.
We're making the standard journalistic assessment with regard to every story that every journalist makes in every single case where they're disclosing somebody else's secrets, about whether the public value and public interest of the disclosure outweighs whatever harm might be caused. And in the course of making that assessment, we have decided thus far to make sure that we're not doing things like disclosing the blueprints for how the NSA technologically intercepts communications, in part because I don't want to enable other states to replicate those methods and enhance their own surveillance capabilities against their citizens or other people. We obviously wouldn't disclose the names of people who are undercover or do anything to jeopardize the ability of the United States to monitor adversary or enemy states.
And what about the security of the documents themselves? So you've got highly classified material here with you in Brazil. How are you making sure that that doesn't get into the wrong hands?
Well, all the documents that I work with are very, very highly encrypted, so that no matter who obtained physical access to the storage of the documents, they would be almost impossible for them to obtain access to it for many, many years. Just the nature of cryptography is such that these passwords are so long and highly complex that even software that guesses 1 billion guesses a second can't access them for probably a decade or even longer. And at the same time, I'm ensuring that they're hidden in places electronically that are impossible to find, and I make sure that they're with me at all times physically as well.
Edward Snowden has said that very openly that he's comfortable with the fact that he feels he's risking perhaps his life and certainly his liberty by making these revelations. What about you? Are you worried about your own personal safety or threats against your liberty?
Well, there have been very prominent political figures and journalists in the United States who have rather openly advocated that I ought to be arrested, that I've committed crimes. So it would be irrational in the extreme for me to ignore those risks and to pretend they didn't exist. At the same time, I know that I have the right to engage in freedom of the press. It's a liberty protected by the very First Amendment of the Constitution of the country of which I'm a citizen. And I also believe that it's my obligation as a journalist and as a human being to defy those kind of threats and to continue to do what I think I'm obligated to do, which is to shine light on what is happening in the world.
And you say you can shine light on this, but can you stop it? I mean, don't you feel that the genie's out of the bottle now, that governments, or at least one government, knows how to access everyone's email, all their messages on social media? How can they stop that? I mean, you might be able to legislate in the United States against it, but surely another country can just do it.
Well, I think that, first of all, governments can get away with doing only that which the populations of the world let them do. And we see examples of that all the time, where very formidable and powerful power centers end up being restricted or even subverted and harmed and ended as a result of backlash from the population that first becomes aware of what they're doing to them and then sufficiently angry and about it and draws a line. So I don't think once a debate like the kind that has been prompted about surveillance and privacy and secrecy starts, we can know where that ends. I also think that it's possible to make it so that the cost to the United States government is so enormously high from continuing to maintain the surveillance state, the cost in terms of how they're perceived around the world, the way that the damage to the reputation, the relationship it does with other governments around the world, that it's possible that they can get to the point where they assess this no longer being worth it from a pure cost-benefit analysis. And then finally, I think the more people are aware of what the United States government is doing, the more it becomes possible to engage in defensive measures against it. So it's possible to start using better encryption, to avoid using companies that cooperate with the United States, to enable surveillance. There's all kinds of measures that private citizens can take as well to impede the ability of the United States to engage in the kind of surveillance that they're trying to engage in.
What about the future of Edward Snowden? Let's assume he ends up in one of these countries that is currently offering him asylum. What's his future?
Well, he'll continue to be the most wanted man on the planet by the world's most powerful state, so obviously his options will be limited in all sorts of ways. But I think what matters to him most is that by not being in an American prison and rendered incommunicado, which is absolutely what will happen to him, he can continue to participate in the debate that he started. He can continue to make himself heard about why he did what he did, about the urgency of thinking about what the government is doing, the U.S. government is doing to privacy around the world, why internet freedom and privacy are so important. And I think that's the thing that's most important to him. If he's confined to one country or two countries or continues to be wanted by the United States government, that's a risk he can definitely live with. And I think ultimately at the end of the day, it's certainly preferable to being in a small cage for the rest of his life in a maximum security prison in the United States, which is what would happen if he returned there.
Whatever happens to his source, Glenn Greenwald says the hoard of information he now has will be producing many more stories in the weeks ahead.